What kind of force can make a bustling city fall into dead silence overnight? We will dig deep into the most unsettling biological terror events in history, from plagues that destroyed countries to those evil curses that originate from cannibalism. This journey will be very wild. Let's begin from the top. Tier 1. The surface. Historical nightmares. The Black Death. A world's collapse. It began in October 1347. Arriving like a death warrant aboard 12 Genoese merchant ships at the Sicilian port of Messina. The people of the city gathered to greet the sailors, only to be met with a grotesque horror. Most of the men aboard were already dead, and the few who were still alive were delirious, covered in black boils that oozed blood and pus. This was Europe's first introduction to Yersinia pestis. While carried by the fleas on black rats, modern science suggests a more terrifying accomplice. Human parasites, which allowed the plague to leap from person to person with breathtaking speed. Medieval medicine was a portrait of utter helplessness. Guided by the ancient theory of miasma, doctors believed the disease was caused by bad air. Their prescriptions were a litany of failures. They lanced the iconic buboes, prescribed baths in vinegar, and even had patients swallow powdered emeralds. Society fractured under the strain. Priests and doctors, sworn to care for the afflicted, abandoned the sick to die alone. Survivors veered to extremes, some throwing themselves into religious fanaticism while others embraced a nihilistic hedonism, living by the motto, "Eat, drink, and be merry. For tomorrow you may die." It was a demographic catastrophe that wiped out up to 60% of Europe's population and triggered the end of feudalism by making the labor of the few survivors incredibly valuable. But here's the deeper biological truth that flows in your veins today. The plague was one of the most powerful forces of natural selection in recent human history. By analyzing DNA from ancient plague pits, scientists have discovered that individuals with a particular variant near the ERAP2 gene were about 40% more likely to survive. This gene supercharged their immune system's ability to destroy the plague bacterium. A stunning evolutionary victory, right? Wrong. That same hyper-efficient immune response selected for by the plague is now a known risk factor for autoimmune disorders like Crohn's disease. The biological solution for a 14th century apocalypse became a medical liability for the 21st, a permanent echo of the plague written into our very code. The 1918 Spanish flu, a modern apocalypse. In 1918, as the Great War was reaching its bloody climax, a novel H1N1 avian flu virus unleashed a modern apocalypse. It didn't start in Spain. That name is a historical accident, a product of wartime lies. The first major recorded outbreak was at a U.S. Army base in Kansas. From there, it traveled with American soldiers to the battlefields of Europe. To maintain morale, the warring nations America, Britain, France, and Germany enacted a brutal policy of censorship, suppressing all news of the spreading illness. Only neutral Spain reported on it freely, creating the false impression that the pandemic was centered there. This was the first truly globalized plague, using modern transportation and the mass movement of troops to infect 1/3 of the world's population in mere months. It killed between 50 and 100 million people, far more than the war itself. Its most terrifying feature was its W-shaped mortality curve. It disproportionately killed healthy adults between 20 and 40 years old. The reason was a phenomenon known as a cytokine storm. The strong immune systems of young adults, when confronted with this new virus, went into overdrive, flooding the lungs with fluids in a catastrophic inflammatory response. Patients were essentially drowned by their own immunity, their skin turning a horrifying blue-purple from lack of oxygen in a condition called cyanosis. The real conspiracy here isn't about the virus's origin, it's about its deliberate, state-sanctioned spread. The war and the pestilence were symbiotic partners. Governments, obsessed with victory on the battlefield, chose to keep the pandemic a secret, a policy that allowed it to spread silently through crowded barracks and troop transports. The machinery of modern warfare became the perfect incubator for a virus that, in turn, acted as an indiscriminate weapon, decimating entire units and sickening armies on both sides. It was a silent, invisible partner in the war, enabled by a conspiracy of silence. Smallpox, the speckled monster and its end. For at least 3,000 years, the shadow of the variola virus hung over humanity. Evidence of its terror was even found on the mummy of Pharaoh Ramses V. It was one of history's greatest killers, responsible for an estimated 300 million deaths in the 20th century alone. In the Americas, it became a decisive tool of conquest. Introduced by European colonizers, it unleashed virgin soil epidemics among indigenous populations with no immunity, wiping out up to 90% of some communities and collapsing the Aztec and Inca empires. The fight against it is the story of humanity's greatest and perhaps only complete triumph against a disease. After centuries of progress from the ancient practice of variolation introduced to Europe by Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, to Edward Jenner's 1,796 experiment, proving that inoculation with cowpox provided safe immunity, humanity launched its final assault. In 1967, the World Health Organization began its intensified smallpox eradication program, using a combination of mass vaccination and a ring vaccination strategy to create immune firewalls. The chain of transmission was broken. On May 8, 1980, smallpox was declared eradicated from the face of the earth. But here's the unsettling truth beneath the celebration. This victory was a geopolitical anomaly, a miracle of cooperation that has never been repeated. The peak of the eradication campaign coincided with the height of the Cold War. Yet, faced with a common terrifying enemy, the United States and the Soviet Union demonstrated a rare unity, providing critical support and collaboration. The universal fear of the speckled monster created a goal that transcended ideology. It's a blueprint for what humanity is capable of, but also a haunting reminder of how rarely we achieve it. Cholera, the Blue Death, and the dawn of public health. For centuries, cholera was confined to its ancestral home in the Ganges Delta. Then, in the 19th century, powered by the steam engine and the trade routes of the British Empire, it exploded into a series of devastating global pandemics. Its speed was terrifying. It could reduce a healthy person to a dehydrated, blue-skinned corpse in a matter of hours. The disease was a brutal physical judgment on the squalid sanitary conditions of the Industrial Revolution, ravaging the crowded slums that lacked clean water and sewage systems. The response was guided by the flawed miasma theory, blaming the disease on bad air rising from the filth. The breakthrough came in 1854, when a skeptical physician named John Snow undertook a methodical investigation that would become the founding act of epidemiology. By mapping the locations of the cases during an outbreak on London's Broad Street, he traced the source to a single contaminated public water pump. He persuaded the local council to remove the pump's handle, and the outbreak subsided. The deeper story here is not about a single doctor's brilliance. It's about how raw terror can fundamentally rewrite the social contract. Cholera's sheer speed and horror created a political urgency that slower, more common killers like tuberculosis never could. The fear of the Blue Death became the primary driver of the sanitary revolution, forcing governments to accept a radical new idea that they had a duty to provide a safe and healthy environment for their citizens. Landmark legislation like Britain's Public Health Act of 1848 spurred the construction of the massive sewer systems and clean water networks that lie beneath our cities today. Our modern world is, in a very real sense, a monument built out of fear, its foundations laid in memory of cholera's victims. Now, we'll dive deeper to meet the classic villains who are just as infamous. Tier 2. Below the surface classic avatars of terror. Tuberculosis, the romantic consumption. In the 18th and 19th centuries, as the Industrial Revolution drove people into crowded, squalid cities, the ancient disease of tuberculosis exploded. Known as consumption for the way it seemed to consume the body from within, or the white plague for the deathly pallor it imparted, it was the leading cause of death in Europe and America. Before it was understood to be contagious, it was widely believed to be hereditary, a sign of a delicate and sensitive constitution. And here's where the story gets truly strange. The Romantic movement glorified it. The disease's slow, wasting nature was seen as bestowing upon its victims a heightened sensitivity and a tragic spiritual purity. The characteristic pale skin, flushed cheeks, and feverish eyes of the consumptive became a morbid standard of beauty, an aesthetic immortalized in works like Puccini's opera La Bohème. Lord Byron famously declared, "I should like to die of a consumption," fueling its tragic mystique. The deeper meaning here is how a single scientific discovery can completely rewrite a disease's cultural code. In 1882, Robert Koch discovered the bacterium Mycobacterium tuberculosis. The romantic illusion was shattered. Consumption was no longer an inherited constitutional flaw that made one a sensitive artist. It was an infectious disease caused by a filthy germ passed from person to person. The idealized consumptive was recast as a dangerous infector. It's a stark lesson in how our perception of illness is a social construct, ready to be demolished by a single terrifying fact. Leprosy. The unclean outcast. Imagine a law that doesn't just punish you for what you do, but for who you are from the moment you are born. That was the reality for sufferers of leprosy for millennia. Vague descriptions in the Old Testament linked the condition to impurity and divine punishment, setting the stage for centuries of stigma. During the Middle Ages in Europe, this reached its apex. Sufferers were made to wear bells to announce their presence and were utterly cast out from society, their very existence seen as a curse. The discovery of the bacillus by Gerhard Armauer Hansen in 1873 ironically worsened the stigma by scientifically confirming that the disease was contagious. This led to the primary response throughout history: forced segregation in medieval lazar houses or colonial-era leper colonies like Kalaupapa in Hawaii. Life in these colonies was a social death. Patients were stripped of their civil rights, separated from their families, and subjected to inhumane practices. The real horror of leprosy isn't the bacterium, which is now easily curable with multi-drug therapy, but the label itself. The word leper became a metaphor for any social outcast. The historical stigma remains so powerful that even today, it is the single greatest barrier to eradication. Fear of social exclusion causes people to hide their early symptoms, delaying treatment. This delay leads to the very physical deformities that created the stigma in the first place, creating a perfect, self-sustaining loop where the social disease is more powerful and enduring than the physical one. Rabies. The inevitable madness. Rabies has always been a uniquely intimate terror, a monster transmitted by the bite of a familiar animal, like a dog, turning a companion into a killer. Before modern medicine, once symptoms appeared, its 100% fatality rate made it an absolute death sentence. The horror lay not just in its certainty, but in the way it destroyed the mind and body. The iconic hydrophobia, where victims are tormented by thirst but seized by terrifying throat spasms at the sight of water. The aggression, the descent into madness it appeared to strip away every shred of humanity. A transformation so complete it helped spawn folklore of werewolves and vampires. Then came the French chemist, Louis Pasteur. The defining moment of his career arrived on July 6, 1885. A 9-year-old boy, Joseph Meister, had been mauled by a rabid dog and was doomed to die. Pasteur, who was not a medical doctor and was racked with anxiety about the risk, made the agonizing decision to use his experimental vaccine on the boy. The treatment was a stunning success. Meister's survival catapulted Pasteur to legendary status and marked the dawn of modern preventative medicine. The deeper story is that this wasn't just a medical breakthrough, it was a profound cultural one. The story of Pasteur and Meister became a modern myth, a dramatic public demonstration of science's power to conquer an ancient archetypal terror. It transformed rabies from an incurable, almost supernatural curse into a preventable microbial disease. Its cultural impact may have been even greater than the number of lives it saved. It was a victory for scientific rationalism over superstition, cementing the heroic authority of science in the public consciousness. Typhus, the fever of war and filth. Epidemic typhus, caused by the bacterium Rickettsia prowazekii, is a disease inextricably linked with human misery, war, famine, and poverty. Its vector, the human body louse, thrives in crowded, filthy conditions, making prisons jail fever and army camps camp fever its ideal breeding grounds. This tiny insect has been a more decisive commander than any general in military history. It killed 5 times more Spanish soldiers than combat during the 1489 siege of Granada. Most famously, it, not the Russian winter, annihilated Napoleon's Grande Armée during the disastrous retreat from Moscow in 1812. Its reign of terror continued through World War I, the Russian Civil War, and the concentration camps of the Holocaust. The breakthrough came in 1909 from a simple but brilliant observation by French physician Charles Nicolle in Tunis. He noticed that typhus patients, once admitted to the hospital where they were bathed and given clean clothes, were no longer contagious. From this, he correctly deduced that the body lice living in their clothing were the vector. The real conspiracy of typhus is that it isn't just a disease of poverty. It is a biological arbiter of political and military failure. The louse is a creature that thrives on the very conditions created by incompetence and brutality, crowding, lack of sanitation, and the inability to wash clothing. Napoleon's decision to invade Russia, forcing his army into the same unwashed uniforms for months, was a formal invitation to an epidemic. The Nazi regime's creation of crowded ghettos was a man-made incubator for the disease. The presence of epidemic typhus became a direct biological measure of a society's collapse, an indictment written by lice on the bodies of soldiers and prisoners. These viruses were eventually solvable, but some eerie plagues appeared suddenly and vanished mysteriously. Brace yourself, we're going deeper. Tier 3, the deep waters, the English sweating sickness. Between 1485 and 1551, a terrifying and mysterious disease struck England in 5 vicious outbreaks. Its first appearance coincided with Henry Tudor's victory at the Battle of Bosworth Field, leading to speculation it was brought by his French mercenaries. Unlike most plagues that targeted the poor, the sweat seemed to prefer the wealthy and powerful, causing immense panic in the Tudor court. During a 1528 outbreak, King Henry VIII fled London in terror, while his future queen, Anne Boleyn, contracted the disease and narrowly survived. Its most horrifying feature was its incredible speed. A person could be healthy at breakfast and dead by dinner. The physician John Caius, who chronicled the disease, described its stages: a sudden sense of dread, followed by violent chills. Then came the terrifying signature symptom: a torrential, foul-smelling sweat, accompanied by delirium and heart palpitations. Finally, an overwhelming lethargy would set in. To fall asleep was to die. Then, after its final outbreak in 1551, it disappeared from history forever. The cause remains one of medicine's greatest unsolved mysteries, but the real story is about cognitive terror. A disease that can strike down the richest and most powerful members of society with incomprehensible speed exposes the utter fragility of social order. The flight of an absolute monarch like Henry VIII was a stark admission that when faced with an enemy that is invisible, inexplicable, and absolute, all human power is meaningless. The sweat is a historical ghost that reminds us our control over nature is, and always has been, an illusion. The plague of Justinian, the first apocalypse. In 541 AD, the Byzantine Emperor Justinian I was on the verge of restoring the glory of the Roman Empire, his armies poised to reconquer the lost Western territories. But at this precise moment of triumph, a plague of unprecedented scale arrived, carried on grain ships from Egypt to the capital, Constantinople. This was the first recorded pandemic of bubonic plague, caused by a strain of Yersinia pestis. The court historian Procopius left a vivid account of the horror, describing the classic plague symptoms of fever, delirium, and the telltale buboes. At its peak, the death toll was so high that the city's infrastructure collapsed. Bodies were left piled in the streets, and traditional burial rites were abandoned. The plague shattered Justinian's dream. It decimated his armies and wrecked the empire's economy, making it impossible to hold the newly reconquered lands. This moment marked the definitive end of the classical era. For centuries, historians focused on the narratives of great men, of emperors and armies, But the deeper truth is that this plague may have been one of the most significant events in Western history. It fatally weakened both the Byzantine Empire and its great rival, the Persian Sasanian Empire, creating a massive power vacuum. Many historians now argue this was a key factor that enabled the lightning-fast expansion of Islam and the Arab conquests of the 7th century. Think about that. Without a random biological event intervening at a critical juncture, the map of Europe and the Middle East and the subsequent histories of Christianity and Islam might have been radically different. It is the ultimate proof that a microscopic agent can be more powerful than any emperor's grand design. Kuru, the Cannibal's Curse. In the mid-20th century, a strange and fatal neurological disease began to spread among the Fore people of the New Guinea highlands. They called it Kuru, meaning to tremble. The disease, which primarily affected women and children, caused a progressive loss of motor control, violent shaking, and, in its final stages, outbursts of pathological, uncontrollable laughter, earning it the terrifying name, the laughing sickness. After intense investigation, researchers eventually linked the disease to the Fore's funerary practices. As a sign of respect, they would ritually cook and consume the bodies of their dead relatives, including the brain. Kuru baffled scientists. It had an incredibly long incubation period and provoked no immune response in its victims. The answer led to a revolutionary biological concept, the prion. Not a virus or a bacterium. A prion is a misfolded protein that acts as an infectious agent, triggering a chain reaction that causes normal proteins in the brain to misfold and clump together, creating sponge-like holes in the brain tissue. The deeper horror here is biology's revenge on culture. Kuru is the ultimate parable, proving that cultural practices are not exempt from biological laws. The near-universal human taboo against cannibalism is not merely a moral construct, it has a deep biological logic. Kuru is the horrific, real-world proof of the curse that awaits when that biological rule is broken. In a stunning twist, the plague created by their culture exerted a powerful selective pressure on their genes, with scientists discovering a unique gene variant in survivors that confers strong resistance to prion diseases. Encephalitis lethargica. In the wake of World War I and the Spanish flu, another mysterious plague swept the globe between 1916 and 1930. Encephalitis lethargica, or the sleepy sickness. Its cause remains unknown, but it infected over 1 million people before disappearing as mysteriously as it arrived. The acute phase was terrifyingly bizarre, with some victims falling into an overwhelming stupor, sleeping for weeks or months, yet remaining conscious of their surroundings, a state like a waking sleep. But the true horror came in the chronic phase, which could develop years later. Survivors would slowly descend into a state of profound Parkinsonism, their bodies becoming rigid and frozen, their faces mask-like. They became living statues, their minds sharp and aware, but trapped inside an immobile physical prison. For decades, these survivors were warehoused and forgotten in long-term care facilities. Their story was brought back to public consciousness in the 1960s by the neurologist Oliver Sacks, whose use of the new drug L-Dopa produced miraculous, though often temporary, awakenings, freeing them from their decades-long stillness. This was a philosophical plague. The experience of being a ghost in the machine, a sentient mind trapped in a frozen body, is a uniquely terrifying form of existence that brutally severs the connection between mind and body. It forces us to ask what, precisely, constitutes a life. It is a disease that doesn't just kill the body, but steals the self, turning a person into a ghost in their own machine. We've already witnessed the curse of a broken taboo. Now, we reach the true bottom of the iceberg to confront the ultimate terrors that transcend disease itself. Tier 4. The Dark Abyss, the Plague of Athens. In 430 BC, during the second year of the Peloponnesian War, the Athenian leader Pericles gathered the rural population inside the city walls to protect them from the invading Spartan army. This defensive strategy created dangerously overcrowded conditions, setting the stage for disaster. An unknown disease ripped through the population, killing between 1/4 and 1/3 of the people, including Pericles himself. The historian Thucydides, who contracted the disease and survived, left a chilling clinical account of its symptoms: raging fever, bleeding from the mouth, and an unquenchable thirst that drove sufferers to throw themselves into wells. But for Thucydides, the true horror was not the physical death, but the death of morality. As people saw the virtuous and the wicked die with equal indifference, all fear of the gods and respect for the law vanished. Social norms disintegrated. Burial rites were abandoned, and people indulged in hedonistic excess, believing they would not live long enough to face the consequences of their actions. The plague marked the end of Athens' golden age. It did not just weaken its military, leading to its eventual defeat by Sparta. It destroyed from within the social cohesion and democratic ideals that had made Athens great. Athenian society was built on a social contract of laws and shared beliefs. The plague, by inflicting a random and meaningless death, rendered that contract void. It is the timeless and terrifying case study of societal collapse, proving that civilization is a fragile construct that can be shattered when the biological reality of our mortality becomes too powerful to ignore. The 1518 Dancing Plague. In July 1518, in the city of Strasbourg, a woman named Frau Trophea walked into the street and began to dance fervently and uncontrollably. Within a week, she had been joined by 36 others. Within a month, the number of dancers had swelled to 400. They were not dancing for joy. They were compelled by an irresistible inner force, dancing until they collapsed from exhaustion, stroke, or heart attack. Some literally danced themselves to death. In a disastrously misguided response, the city authorities and physicians concluded that the cure was more dancing. They cleared a public space, built a stage, and even hired musicians, a decision that likely fueled the collective mania. The most widely accepted modern theory is that this was a case of mass psychogenic illness, or mass hysteria, triggered by extreme psychological distress. The people of Strasbourg in 1518 were suffering from severe famine, poverty, and disease. This intense, prolonged stress, combined with a local superstition that street Vitus could inflict a dancing curse, created the perfect cultural soil for the outbreak. The deep, unsettling truth here is that the mind itself can be a pathogen as powerful as any virus. This was not a disease in the conventional sense, but a collective, ritualized expression of trauma. The dancers' bodies became a stage for the unbearable anxiety of the entire community. It is a terrifying reminder that a society's shared fears and beliefs can manifest as a real, physical, and even fatal epidemic, blurring the line between a medical event and a cultural phenomenon. Nodding syndrome, the modern mystery. This is a modern horror story happening right now. Nodding syndrome is a mysterious neurological illness found only in specific, isolated, and impoverished regions of East Africa that have been ravaged by civil war. The disease affects only children, typically between the ages of 5 and 15. Its name comes from its most prominent symptom. When presented with food or feeling cold, the child begins to nod their head in an uncontrollable, seizure-like fit, making it nearly impossible to eat and leading to severe malnutrition. The disease is progressive, stunting physical and cognitive growth. Many die from malnutrition or from accidents, such as drowning or falling into a fire during a seizure. The leading scientific theory links it to the parasitic worm that causes river blindness, suggesting the syndrome is an autoimmune response where antibodies mistakenly attack the brain. But local communities have their own explanations rooted in the trauma of war: poisoned relief food, chemical weapons, or the vengeful spirits of the dead. The conspiracy isn't a secret plot. It's a silent one, of global indifference. Nodding syndrome is a contextual disease, the tragic product of a shattered ecosystem where the long-term consequences of war, poverty, and parasitic exposure have combined to create a new and horrifying pathology. It is a disease of the forgotten, destroying a generation of children in communities that are already on the margins. It is a potential harbinger of future diseases, born from the toxic interplay of social collapse and infectious agents. Fibrodysplasia ossificans progressiva. Finally, we have a terror that comes not from an outside invader, but from a fundamental betrayal deep within our own genetic code. Fibrodysplasia ossificans progressiva, or stone man syndrome, is one of the rarest and most disabling genetic conditions known. It is a terrifying process in which soft connective tissues like muscles, tendons, and ligaments are progressively turned into bone, creating a second skeleton that locks a person into a prison of their own making. The disease is caused by a single mutation in a gene that regulates bone growth. This mutation throws the body's repair mechanism into overdrive. Any minor injury, a bump, a fall, even a medical injection triggers a catastrophic response, where the damaged soft tissue is replaced not with scar tissue, but with permanent, normal bone. Patients are born with a telltale sign: malformed big toes. From there, they live with the constant, creeping loss of mobility as new bone forms, freezing joints in place. Most are bedridden by their 30s and die around age 40, typically from respiratory failure when their rib cage becomes a solid, immovable cage of bone, preventing their lungs from expanding. This is the ultimate conceptual body horror. The process of being slowly and irreversibly imprisoned and suffocated by one's own skeleton. It is not a system failing, but a system working too perfectly in the wrong context. The body's blueprint for building a skeleton is so powerful that a single error in its genetic code allows it to run rampant, executing its program flawlessly, but with devastating consequences. FOP is a terrifying revelation that the very biological processes designed to build and sustain us can, with the smallest of errors, become the architects of our own inescapable cage.